if you're in California, and good evening if you're in India. So today we are delighted and honored to have Professor VijayRaghavan taking part in our discussion series here at Yale as a part of the Computation and Society Initiative. Professor VijayRaghavan is the Principal Scientific Advisor for the Government of India. This is a position he has held for the last couple of years, I believe. He's also an emeritus professor and the director of one of the topmost biological institutes in the world, the National Center for Biological Sciences. He has won a lot of accolades for his work, including, he's a fellow of the Royal Society. He's a foreign associate of the National Academy of Science. He also was awarded the Padma Shri, which is one of the highest civilian honors given by the government of India. I can go on and on about him, but in the interest of time, let me just once again welcome him and for taking out time in such, I cannot even imagine pressure on time on you. So thank you, Vijay. So we have also a distinguished panelist here today, Joe Howard, a professor of molecular biophysics and biochemistry, director of the Quantum Bio Institute, Steve Wilkinson, professor of political science and director of the Macmillan Center, Rohini Pandey, professor of economics and director of the Economic Growth Center, and Alan Gerber, who's the professor of political science and the dean of social science. And we also have special guest Umesh Vazirani, who's a world expert in quantum computing and a professor in Berkeley. With that, Vijay, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Nishit, and hello, everybody. And I'm honored to be here. It's a really wonderful panel along with me, and I look forward to our interactions. We are living, to put it very mildly, in extremely interesting times. And this is something which many people over the last several decades, particularly over the last 10 years or so, have been talking about. So it's not something which is a surprise, but yet the way it has hit us and it's happened on such a scale is something which has stirred us all immensely. And when we are done with this and we go out of this, we will surely not be the same world again. And what world that will be, we don't know. So I will divide my brief intervention into three components. One, about where this is coming from. Second, what are we doing about this, primarily from an Indian perspective? And then finally, what will this be like getting out of this? Will there be drugs, vaccines? And if yes, how will they go ahead? And if not, what will we do? But I'd like to start first with two quotes. One from a book written in 1859 by Charles Darwin, written in a hurry because he didn't want to get scooped. And the introduction ends with the following quote. He says, "There's a grandeur in this view of life with its several powers, having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved." So this is a wonderful view of evolution. It points out how, the beauty, the grandeur of life has come about through evolution by natural selection. And in many ways, what we see today is that consequence in very different manner from what that paragraph would suggest. And I'd read the second quote, and this is from a book by David Quammen. It's called Spillover. It talks about how diseases can go or pathogens can go from other animals into human. And he says, it's a mildly technical term, zoonosis, unfamiliar to most people, but it helps clarify the biological complexities behind the ominous headlines about swine flu, flu, bird flu, SARS, emerging diseases in general, and the threat of a global pandemic. This book was written about 10 years ago, I think. Well, no, about 5 or 6 years ago, after the first SARS epidemic. It helps us comprehend why medical science and public health campaigns have been able to conquer some horrific diseases, such as smallpox and polio, but unable to conquer other horrific diseases, such as dengue and yellow fever. It says something essential about the origin of AIDS. It's the word of the future destined for heavy use in the 21st century. Zoonosis, that is. It's a word of the future. And he goes on to point out that with zoonosis, with zoonotic diseases, they can hide in a manner where diseases unique to humans cannot. Diseases unique only to humans, such as smallpox, for example, or even polio, are eradicable because once you get rid of them by a variety of ways, such as with the vaccine, that's it, you're done. But with zoonotic diseases, they will keep coming again and again because you can deal with one, but there's a reservoir, there's change taking place in that reservoir, and from that, new diseases, new spillovers can occur. So how does that happen, and how can one prevent it? Now, we know that SARS coronavirus 2 is a coronavirus, like with SARS coronavirus 1, with MERS and so on. There have been several major coronavirus infections which have gone across the world. The common cold is one, but there have been a handful which have had severe consequences. The interesting thing about this one, the coronavirus 2, as distinct from the SARS coronavirus 1, was that was an upper respiratory tract infection which could spread relatively fast, but was relatively mild. This is a lower respiratory tract infection, but combines that property of being able to spread fast, and therefore combines both speed as well as severity. And this poses an enormously different kind of challenge. So how did this come about? We know by looking at the genetic sequence of the virus and looking at coronavirus sequences in general. And much of this work started in 2003 from researchers from the US going to China, sequencing the genomes of viruses found in bats all over the wet markets and bat caves over there. And from these kinds of studies, and most recent study on the current pandemic, we know that these coronaviruses are harbored in bats, and there are many different kinds of coronaviruses. Bats have an extraordinarily high metabolic activity, and they provide great harbors for these viruses, but also modulate their immune inflammatory response so that they themselves are not infected. So this is a terrific opportunity for the viruses to mix their genomes and keep changing and trying their luck out about what forms they can take, not the beautiful forms which Darwin referred to, but forms which can spill over. And these spillover events occur in a variety of ways. Typically, if there is close contact between two different species, bats, for example, and pangolins and humans and so on. Now, these kinds of spillover events are low probability events. They don't, it's not that one person happened to go to a market and did something wrong and now the world is in horrible shape. Yes, that might have happened, but these kinds of interactions keep happening over time. And as a famous evolutionary biologist, Dobzhansky said, given enough time, an event, no matter how low the probability, will certainly happen. And if these kinds of interactions keep going on for a long, long time, then there will be some instance where the spillover happens. So a spillover from bat or pangolin to humans has happened by a lock and key fitting really well, by a receptor or receptors in the human cell providing a fit for the key from the bat, allowing the virus to infect us. Now, this points to something very important. We don't know a lot about this virus, but we do know quite a bit. And what we know, what I've said, and a lot more, both about the virus and responses to the virus in human, points to the importance of studying three kinds of disciplines. One, population genetics in multiple ways to see how genes expand in population or viruses spread. That kind of mathematical computational analysis is very, very important and needs to go on scale. In many ways, in many countries, this has not been emphasized enough. Along with that, we need to study genetics, how mutations take place, how they are selected for, and we need to thirdly study public health and epidemiology. All these three things put together needs to scale up enormously in our ecosystems. And it's because there is substantial investment. We need to do more, of course, but there's already substantial investment that we're able to understand so much all over the world, and particularly from my perspective, from India. India is unusual amongst the countries in the South in having invested in science and technology, and therefore not only has the ability to deal with these problems by looking at understanding from all over the world, but can also contribute to that understanding and to solutions. So that's the first part. We know where the virus came from and perhaps to some extent how it infects people. We don't know enough about responses in people. Now let me go on to the second part of my talk about what is happening in our context in India and all over the world. When the possibilities of human-to-human transmission came to light, and there was a potential epidemic or pandemic coming about, there were multiple kinds of responses which countries all over the world took. First, in the Wuhan city and the Hubei province in China, in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, in South Korea, in Singapore, in Europe, in Italy, in France, in the UK, the US, in India, and now in other countries everywhere. At that time, there were many, many theories about the way the spread could take place. There were lots of people modeling, and there were lots of projections of the modeling. And people all over the world had many kinds of responses. One was a response saying, my God, this is going to be absolutely worrisome. Let's do everything to stop this. And the most extreme viewpoint was taken up as a real possibility. And there were others at the other end of the spectrum saying, oh, this is just another seasonal infection, it'll go away. 2 points here. One, why is this different and not merely another seasonal infection? We already are in the throes of it, so that question is in some ways moot now. But it's important to keep in mind when we have a new disease which has a significant case fatality rate, it transmits easily, one has to be very, very careful because one must fear the exponential. The rise can be very sharp. And that sharp rise, even though eventually when it plateaus, can result in a contribution to the yearly death rate or the monthly death rate of an amount which societies can handle. This sharp rise and localized distributed rise in multiple places can cripple the health system or industry. And that's what we've sadly seen happening in many places all over the world. So this is something which we rightly were worried about and rightly should still be worried about. What is our response to this? Everyone now, everywhere in the world, knows about flattening the curve. And indeed, India has done that too. We, first of all, started looking at and quarantining people who are coming in from abroad. And those were the sets of people significantly tested. And then later on, the efforts of testing, tracking, and quarantining people went to other vulnerable sets in society, as well as their contacts and the contacts of those who came in. And as time progressed, more and more different components of people are being tested. But fundamentally, there was also a lockdown, and this is extraordinary. A country this size, 1.3 billion going into lockdown, all on one day, is an enormous, movement of high momentum coming down to near stop in a very short time. That, of course, has enormous pressures of various times. And the country has done extraordinarily well in the public spiritedness of the response to the demands of the lockdown. There have been, of course, many significant problems. They are constantly being addressed, but also industry, the government, the corporate sector, non-government organizations, all of them have come together in a manner which is absolutely extraordinary to make sure that there's minimum problems during the lockdown, but more importantly, from the point of view of post-lockdown, using this time to set up hospital beds, equipment, PPEs, protective equipment, testing kits, and so on and so forth. So now when we go from the lockdown to an opening up, we have a better preparedness on what I would call the defensive front to take on what is likely to happen. Now, this, of course, is not sufficient. Just a defensive approach where we have everything ready to look after our most vulnerable sections, the poor, the elderly, those who have prior complications, are very, very important. But this keeps you, one step behind the virus, and it, doesn't allow you to quell the spread of the pandemic. How does one have offensive tools at this time when you don't have a drug or a vaccine? And I'll come to the drug or a vaccine for the third part. The two offensive tools we have right now really are only testing and tracking. Testing was a bottleneck for a country this size in terms of reagents and kits and so on. That has now been streamlined, and there are other mechanisms of testing, which I'll come back to in a moment, but testing is scaling up. Now, contact tracing poses an extraordinary challenge. India has done extraordinarily well historically in contact tracing in other diseases such as polio or smallpox or rotavirus and so on and so forth in terms of looking at the immunization program, not for contact tracing over there. So our immunization program, as well as our contact tracing, goes right down to the individual level in every village. But that's a manual process, and that can take time. Now we would like contact tracing to use that manual process, but also be done with great speed and with great efficiency. For that, we've got a digital tool. It's called Arogya Setu. It's a health bridge, as it were. And this is an app for which there's already, as of today, I think about 80 million downloads. We will have a feature phone version in a day or two. And therefore, with the feature phone version, with the smartphone version, and with a version which allows people to contact those without any phones, we hope to be able to cover a very large part of every community in the country. Then, should anyone in such communities or anywhere test positive, we can go back in time over the previous 10 or 15 days and find out who their proximal contacts were and decide what to do, how to test them, how to quarantine, and so on. And this needs to be done with great speed and efficiency. And it's quite extraordinary that this is being attempted on such a large scale. So this digital intervention, along with testing, will allow us, hopefully, to be one step ahead of the virus. And this will confer what some people have called digital immunity, analogous to herd immunity. This term has been used by a friend of Umesh's and myself, Shivaji Sondhi at Princeton. Now, this then provides a way for us to start functioning in a manner which allows the economy to come back to steam, as it were, while we focus our health attentions in addition on getting drugs and vaccines. We also need to keep in mind that India has a huge immunization program which cannot stop. We have people who have, as everywhere else in the world, who have various kinds of health issues. They need to be attended to. Babies will be born every day. Some of them, many of them will be cesarean births. So hospital interventions for normal purposes as well as for routine care such as dentists, diabetes, heart and lung issues, fevers, all of that needs to be done. And therefore testing and tracking will allow not just the industrial and the economy sector to go up, but also to allow these other activities to carry on. It's complicated, but there is really, until drugs and vaccines come, no other way. But this has to be done so nimbly and so fast that it actually helps in a real situation. And this period of lockdown has helped put all of this in place. What about drugs and vaccines? Drugs, as you all know, are complicated when we are dealing with viruses. Drugs have to act in a manner which they don't have huge side effects. And viruses like this use substantially our host machinery. And therefore, to get a drug which is unique to the virus is not easy. Remdesivir, which affects the proofreading mechanism of the virus, presumably, and therefore is relatively specific, seems to have some hope in the trials as we go forth. Let's see how that pans out. There are over 80 companies all over the world looking at vaccines of different kinds, vaccines which are encoded by nucleic acid, RNA or DNA, inactivated viruses, vaccines which use other viral vectors as carriers in which the spike protein is put in, encoding region is put in, or raising antibodies against the spike protein and so on. Many of them are in phase 1 trial. They'll go on to phase 2 soon. India has one of the world's largest vaccine manufacturing companies. 2 out of 3 vaccines which every child gets is made in India. So Indian companies are collaborating with these global companies in the manufacturing component. But notably, Indian companies have also embarked on independent vaccine development, as have in academia. So this has, allowed a concerted global effort as well as a national effort in vaccine and drug development, as also in the development of hospital equipment, PPEs, and so on. Much of those were imported largely from China, and today many of those are beginning to be manufactured in India, including kits and reagents and so on. India is also participating in the global solidarity trials with the WHO and collaborating with major organizations such as CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, and other organizations in vaccine development. So this is what is happening now in terms of the vaccine part and the drugs part, and we look forward to a combination of this working out as well as a combination of releasing the lockdown with measures to track and trace and keep our most vulnerable safe while we bring back the economy to speed while looking after our health. It's not a binary, as many people said. We've had discussions all over the world where there's talk about every single life matters to at the other end saying, well, what's the big deal if a few thousand people lose their lives? We will get the economy back. That's a false binary and a wrong way to pose the question. In countries like India in particular, where there's an enormous range of income disparity, wealth disparity, and need, it's very important for us to have both lives and livelihood go together. So I'll stop here and look forward to questions from the panel, for discussions of the panel and questions from you.
Well, thank you, Vijay, for the very nice introduction and talk. Let's start with the panelists now. We have Rohini.
Thank you. That was a fascinating presentation and very informative. I wanted to talk to you a little. I wanted to hear a little bit more about your proposal on the track and tracing, especially after the lockdown. India has certainly ramped up its testing by a lot, but even so, at best case, as well, the size of the population is going to remain a low testing population. And so right now, I think the ICMR policy, for instance, on testing asymptomatic patients, which are one of the big sources of transmission, is only if they've been in contact with someone who has been found to be positive. There's recently been a lot of suggestion that perhaps kind of a smart policy for testing would actually try to identify, say, high-risk groups like frontline workers, hospital workers, or high-risk areas where you have, say, a previous history of illness or elderly individuals, and have a testing policy that actually accounts for the fact that you're not going to get to everyone, and so you want to think about high-risk groups. So I'd be curious to hear whether that's an area of expansion. The second question I had on the stop is, there's been a lot of discussion also about the importance of viral dose, like viral load, how much you're exposed. And so again, in a country like India, where social distancing may just be hard to achieve in many sectors, how do you think about the trade-off between a full lockdown policy versus trying to have policies that actually reduce the viral load, say very aggressive masking policies or hand washing policies?
Well, thank you very much. These are both two very important points. Let me go over the testing part first. Yes, I think we are seeing a dynamic expansion of the criteria for testing as the kits become available and the feasibility of doing different kinds of tests happen. That is indeed happening. Frontline workers, those at risk, already are in categories who can avail of tests, and those who have been in contact with them are identified even if they are asymptomatic. Your point about broadening the test, let me answer in two different ways. The issue which is important in the Indian context is that there are many different kinds of regions. There are cities such as Mumbai, which are parts of which are very, very crowded. And there are other parts of the state or states which are less crowded. There are hotspots, there are potential hotspots, and the regions where they haven't had many positives. So what we are trying to do now, what we have started doing now is the following. We need to break these components into different regions, which we have done, the different zones. That's been done by the Health Ministry and the Home Ministry. And what we've embarked as a research project first, and which will be scaled up into application once we get the results, is to have assays for prevalence in different zones. And this will be using a combination of the gold standard RT-PCR as well as antibody assays, which are lab-based, which are very reliable. They're called the ELISA test, as also serology tests, whose specificity is variable, but importantly, those mass scale tests need to be understood statistically in the context of prevalence in each region, and therefore needs to be analyzed. So these kinds of combinations of expansion of testing will give you what is importantly an estimate of deaths divided by recovered cases or cases which have plus deaths. In other words, you look at that fraction of those who have been identified as positive and who have recovered or died as the denominator, and at the numerator you have those who have died, and that gives you an estimate of what is happening in a particular region, and that combined with prevalence estimates can be valuable. So the expansion of testing along these lines is happening and hopefully will give us information. Now the second component, very briefly, is very, very important about social distancing in crowded areas. My office has collaborated with several of our scientists in my office have collaborated with others to do two things. First of all, an advisory on masks and face covers was brought out, and the importance of that. That's gained huge national traction, and people, when they go out, use them a lot. almost universally. And that has resulted, even if that results in a lower transmission by a few percent, the effective consequences for disease spread can be enormous. Now, the second component, which we've given some advisories, is for densely populated areas, such as in Mumbai. Dharavi is an iconic example of what measures one takes over there in terms of, hand washing, where community toilets are shared by several thousand people to a toilet. Bathing areas again are shared. So those kinds of advisories have gone out about how one deals with the day as well as the evening. And so those measures are very tough, but combined with testing and tracking can hugely reduce disease burden, hopefully, as also the intensity of spread from person to person, and thereby, hopefully, the intensity of disease. Sorry, that was an answer, Rohini. Yeah.
Stephen, do you want to go next?
Yeah, so thank you very much for being willing to speak to the middle of the evening there. I had a couple of questions. First, in the US, we have a federal system like in one of the challenges we're seeing here is states are likely to have inconsistent standards with others in terms of ending lockdowns. We're seeing that in one or two southern states already. And so one question is, how has the coordination on strategies so far across states, and how do we expect that to go in the future? And then the second question is about migration. To open up the, India's a country with a lot of migration. We've seen a migration after the lockdown started of people back to villages in their home regions. And in order to open up the economy, in order to plant summer crop from late May onwards, we're going to have migration back to rural and urban areas. And how are you thinking about how to ensure that's done in a way as possible?
Yeah. Both these, thank you, Steve. Both these are important challenges. The migration issue is a big one, both, during the lockdown, it posed enormous challenges, and therefore country has learned a lot from that. And as the lockdown eases, my estimate is that issue will be addressed in a manner which causes least pain, particularly because the lockdown itself is being eased in a calibrated manner. It poses enormous challenges in our infrastructure to transport people while maintaining social distancing. Now, about the federal structure, that's a very interesting question. Health is what is called on the concurrent list. In other words, both states and the central government have responsibility. But disasters also come under a national law which can go across all states. And therefore that disaster management authority and law in some ways gives federal cover. But importantly, what's happened is there's been lots of consultation, and the extension of the lockdown, for example, and its imposition in the first place was something which was discussed widely with state governments. And they had, for the extension, as far as I know, a unanimous view that they wanted more time. So there hasn't been any dissonance about that matter. The state governments still have the authority, which they have rightly exercised, to decide what to do at the ground level. They get a huge range of advisories right down to the district level from the National Disaster Management Agency and from the Health Ministry. They get supplies of reagents and kits and equipment and resources, but the action at the ground is done by the states in a very well coordinated manner. And India has got a history of this kind of a state-center collaboration for healthcare delivery, primary healthcare delivery, health services at multiple levels. So the plumbing is in place and it's been activated really well. There are, of course, going to be lots of problems in the pipeline. There'll be all sorts of glitches in a crisis like this in particular, but those, by constant feedback, can be addressed in a country which is stretched for resources, enormous in size, but needs to do all of this efficiently. It's a big challenge, but everyone's coming together.
Vijay, this is Joe Howard here. Terrific. It was so interesting what you've had to say. My question is, India has many great biology institutes and research like NCBS, and I just wonder what role are those institutes playing in fighting the coronavirus? I mean, are you mobilizing them for testing or what have you? I mean, are they open and are they working on coronavirus? Is that being coordinated? I'd be very fascinated to know, how that is in India. My question.
That's such a wonderful question, Joe. It almost seems as if I've asked you to ask that question because one of the standard gripes which many people in India have was, here are these really top-class institutions, and before all this happened, many people used to say, well, these places are a short walk from India. They have really top-quality students and faculty. They do wonderful research. Then many of the students go away abroad, and then the best come back, and then they train people to train others to go away abroad and come back. And there was this deprecatory aspect about this. Our engineering institutions had that kind of a label on them, but they have transformed the IT sector and some other sectors, so less so. But what has happened here is something absolutely astounding. All these institutions, right from people who are doing pure abstract mathematics to hardcore engineering, have come together. The Bangalore institutes have come together, the Pune, the Hyderabad, the Chennai, the Delhi ones, and each one of them have done extraordinary things, right from kit development, working on vaccines, working on PPE, making ventilators. It is just, I don't like using hyperbolic statements, but it is so, absolutely wonderful to see people come together in this manner. And all these constant gripes about them being in their silos, it's vanished. Chemists are working with biologists who are working with mathematicians and physicists. It's really terrific. We've got to, from a structural point of view, there has been a coordination by two major kinds of committees. There's a committee, so this had already started when a few days ago, a committee for vaccines and R&D was formally constituted. It has Dr. Vinod Paul, who drives the medical agenda for the COVID response, and I as co-chairs. And there's also something called an Empowered Technology Group, which was constituted early February, but has been very valuable for these kinds of R&D efforts. So these groups now have done wonderful things, but in addition, top down, we have opened up research agendas in many areas, such as in serology, in public health issues, in clinical trials, and so on. So you'll see a lot more of that also.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Raghavan. So my question is about contact tracing and just the measures that will be put into place as you move from the lockdown period to the post-lockdown period. We're of course thinking a lot about that in the United States right now, and I think as I reflect on it, what will be different after this initial wave of the pandemic versus before is, as you pointed out, some of the defensive tools will be in place. So we'll be better prepared to treat the disease. And then there will also be some level of herd immunity. So some percentage of the population will be able to, not be infected. But if that percentage of the population is relatively small, we'll still be very vulnerable, I guess, to another round and another round after that. And so these tools like testing and contact tracing are really essential to trying to manage the disease until the vaccines kick in. So my question for you is in the context of India, you mentioned 80 million people downloaded the app. Approximately like what share of the Indian population do you think will be participating in contact tracing like you described? Can you tell me a little bit about how the data that's being produced by those apps are going to be managed? And then could you just tell me a little bit about how the math of this works? That is, do you multiply the R naught by the share of the population that is involved in contact tracing to get a sense of the importance of contact tracing in preventing spread once you move to the post-lockdown phase, or is it something like the effects are multiplied in some way such that even if a modest portion of the population engages in contact tracing, that might have disproportionate effects on lowering the infectivity?
Okay. Thanks a lot, Alan. Now there are a big challenge as far as herd immunity or vaccines go. We can be hopeful that herd immunity in due course will kick in. We are hopeful about a vaccine, but remember, a vaccine, even if it's made, it has to be manufactured in bulk, and then you have to decide who to give it and roll it out and get that done. It'll take time. It's very valuable to have a vaccine. It'll take time, but let's hope we get it. And similarly with immunity, we still don't know what is the extent of immunity people will have. Do people with mild symptoms have immunity for a longer time also or not? Do people with severe symptoms, do they have protection for a significant period? All of that we will start knowing soon. In that situation, you're absolutely right. Contact tracing is really very important. It's agnostic to the disease, and therefore it's a very, very valuable tool. The problem with this disease, with SARS coronavirus 2 virus, is we don't know yet, but it's a reasonable assumption to make that asymptomatic people are also infected. And therefore, the kinds of calculations you make for the effectiveness of contact tracing need to take that into account. And typically, if you put this as a problem equivalent mathematically to herd immunity, for herd immunity in the routine sense, you can get herd immunity anywhere between 30 to 50 to 60% of the population for a variety of diseases people have shown. That gives you reasonable herd immunity. But in this situation where asymptomatic transmission can potentially be significant, when you do the calculations, such as my friend Shivaji Sondhi at Princeton has done in an archives paper, which has been posted a few days ago, his calculation is you need rather higher levels of use of the contact tracing in such an extreme situation to get herd immunity, to get digital immunity. Now, in India, as I told you, 80 million people so far have downloaded the app. There are, I think, something like over 200 odd million, 250 or 300 million smartphone users. There are several hundred more million feature phone users. And our aim is to get that number of people who use this up to as much of that component as possible. And our team has made calculations on different levels of success one can get depending on how many people use it. And remember that we are not talking about use pan-India as one unit, but there are cities, there are areas where this will be used, and then taking into account migration is another challenge. But if migration is minimal, at least for some time, this can be potentially very effective, anywhere from, I would say, 60% in some contexts to 80 or 90% using this in others. And that seems like incredibly feasible in a place like India.
Thank you, Vijay, for the answer. So I have a couple of questions So one is, I mean, it's probably more general, affects the science community broadly in India. I mean, how does all this affect funding and restructuring of scientific priorities in the context of India? And my second question is about the use of machine learning or artificial intelligence in diagnosing. Are you guys thinking about that? Is that an option? I mean, given that there'll be this app, Arogya Setu, will be widely deployed, I mean, you do have the potential to collect other data about individuals and get better sense of whether they might be affected or not.
Well, your second part of your question, I didn't answer Alan's point related to this. The back end of the Arogya Setu integrates information from publicly available and elsewhere. The health system does all of what you said, runs algorithms of various kinds on it and feeds back into the decision-making system at the higher speed. There are still some, nuts and bolts which have to be tightened on that. The app is only a few weeks old, but that feedback system uses some of the tools you said. In addition to that, the people in our industry startup ecosystem are computer scientists of the kind Joe referred to. They are using AI and machine learning tools to track people with symptoms, learn on those who become positive, and then try to see whether diagnostic tools in terms of the way people cough or smell or chest x-rays can be useful in diagnosis. Too early to say how that will go, but there's a lot of work going on. And a lot of that happening all over the world, of course.
And then the first question was about how this might affect the funding and restructuring of science.
Yes. So we've already started having discussions in the government. See, our financial year ends in April, and that was postponed. The year ending was postponed because of this. And now we will start our financial year very soon. And this, of course, has thrown a big spanner in, our plans as usual. And so lots of recalibration have to take place in everything we do. How much attention are we going to pay to business as usual stuff? How much are we going to recalibrate? How much are we going to invest in the kinds of areas which I told you right at the beginning, in ecology, evolutionary biology, and genetics? How much in digital aspects? And one aspect which comes out from all the components I've told you is how integrative three components are. One is relatively important but modest technically, public health interventions of various kinds. A public health system has to be uniformly across the country, top class, using simple standard methods. The second layer on that is biology in its broader sense. Medicine, biology, ecology, genetics, epidemiology, that needs to be critical. And that has its foundations both in the life sciences and in the quantitative sciences. And the third is similar to what has happened with the Arogya Setu. The IT and digital tools are going to be invaluable in combining these first two with tech to deliver to people in a rapid time frame. So our funding priorities will have significant impact on these three and also on all kinds of fundamental research which relate to these three. How much resources one will have in this situation, how we will distribute them is a big challenge. That's a challenge all over the world.
Thank you, Vijay. I think Umesh Wazirani here wanted to ask you a question.
Hi, Vijay. Thanks a lot for this this presentation and these great questions. So, I just wanted to ask you, looking ahead, it seems like even after this is over, life will be quite different, and so that may also in some ways be an opportunity in the context of India. So for example, is that an opportunity to, while things are so different and so much effort and investment is being made to deal with this crisis, is it also an opportunity to, let's say, move towards a more digital economy and is this something that's being explored? How do we come out of it, and how do we come out of it in a much stronger way?
No, I think this is a very critical point, Umesh. It's a wake-up call on multiple fronts. India was fortunate in having put in digital payment mechanism and digital tools on a huge scale over the last 3 or 4 years. That's allowed people to pay others in a manner which otherwise would not have been easy. And that's something very valuable. And the infrastructure which went into those kinds of the development of those tools and our IT industry has proven invaluable here in telemedicine. I didn't talk about that. In delivery of training courses to healthcare workers at the ground level. So digital has been truly, truly invaluable in multiple ways, and that will only grow enormously, no question about that. In addition, it's a wake-up call on 2 other fronts. One, in terms of our industry and global supply chains. It's a network problem, you know that more than anyone else. If you have a network dependent on a very small number of critical nodes, then stuff happens as it's happened now. So we must have global supply chains which are not dependent on the stability of just 1 or 2 nodes in a network, and that needs to change. And it's a wake-up call to Indian manufacturing, and to global manufacturing, which I think our industry at every level, micro, small, medium industry, large industry will heed. The third wake-up call relates to our environment and climate change. So far, we have been talking about climate change issues largely from the point of view of contributing to greenhouse gases and containing those contributions, and not looked upon it as a combination of those issues and environmental issues. I'll give you an example. We have talked about the wet markets in China and how they've caused this pandemic. But keep in mind that with climate change, we can have disastrous consequences and pandemics around us from within us. The example I like to give is the Saiga antelope in Kazakhstan. It's a very hardy antelope, but still because of the difficult conditions, many of its kids die every year. A few years ago, several thousands of them died at one shot, one summer. And a couple of years ago, the reason for that was found. The ambient temperature that summer went up by 1.5 degrees, resulting in a commensal bacterium in the nasal passages becoming invasive and causing sepsis. Now, this is the kind of switch on, switch off epidemic which can happen because of changes in organisms, because of the consequences of environmental effects which we have brought about. I'm not saying this will happen. These are low probability events, but just like zoonosis is a low probability event, which happens over time, if you prolong the kinds of contact, these kinds of contacts will happen. Similarly, our waterways, our garbage, all of that are potential sources of various kinds of transmission. So that's also a wake-up call. So our environment, climate change, number one, our way our industry functions, and a digital structure which enables global communication and national communication are ways in which the world will change enormously.
Okay, I think we are almost out of time, but if somebody has one pressing question that they would like to ask Vijay, or Vijay, maybe you could conclude with your last thoughts before we end this meeting. I think we have 2 minutes.
Well, I'm sorry I took so long, but first of all, thank you all very, very much. Being here and more importantly, getting your views has allowed me to sharpen mine and think about things in a manner which otherwise I would not have. So I'm very grateful for that. I would also like to end by saying that we have oscillated between, not oscillated, there are 2 kinds of views about the world which we've debated over years. One is a nativist, let's go back to nature view, and all tech development, everything is interfering with stuff and so on. And the other is a hubris of how science and technology and human ingenuity can solve any problem. This is another kind of wake-up call where a balance between understanding natural ecosystems, how they function scientifically, what kind of moderation one needs, what kind of technological interventions one needs, and where our priority should be, needs to be done. And this needs to be done not just at national levels or local levels, but at the level of humanity. What's happened very simply is humanity has moved from what Darwin has said as being one of the beings on this canvas of Earth to becoming those who wield the paintbrush, as Dan Dennett said, that we now wield the paintbrush on the canvas of Earth. We are responsible not just for ourselves, but for our planet. And therefore, globally, our institutions need to take this responsibility, not just for ourselves, but for the planet also.
Thank you, Vijay, and thank you everyone for attending this very, very informative session. I can only say that India is lucky to have someone like Vijay at the helm of things, especially when we look at India from here, from the US. And once again, thanks a lot, Vijay, for your, for all the wisdom and the knowledge and the inspiration that you shared with us. Thank you for taking out your time. We can only imagine how incredibly busy you are. And thanks to all the panelists, Joe, Rohini, Steve, Alan, and Umesh. We say good night to you from the US, and good afternoon, everybody.
Thank you very much. Take care. Thank you, Nishit, and thank you everyone else. Bye-bye.
Bye.